Hello there, it's Adam Fleming here, host of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast, and we're bringing you a live recording of today's episode. So touch wood, it all goes well, fingers crossed for us. You're going to be hearing some top-flight, world-class analysis of the spring statement, which was delivered by the Chancellor Rachel Reeves at Westminster at lunchtime. We'll be hearing from our economics editor, Faisal Islam, our deputy economics editor, Dharshini David, and political editor and friend of Newscast, actually more than a family member of Newscast, Chris Mason. So anyway, sit back and watch us try not to muck it up. Wish us luck. Hello, it's Adam in the studio.
And it's a friend of the podcast, Chris, in Westminster. Hello.
And it's foe of the podcast, Dharshini. Hi.
And it's distant family of the podcast, Faisal.
Also, do you know what? While we're doing all of these gags, I need to apologise to you, Dharshini, because last time you were on this podcast, I called you Chief Economics Correspondent, but you've actually had an upgrade since then.
Well, you know.
Basically, a bit like the growth projections as a result of the spring
I've
statement.
been inflated, is what you're saying.
Yes. Oh, we can talk about inflation another day. Right. Just before we dive into the details of what Rachel Reeves announced at lunchtime today, a lot of which we actually knew in advance because it's been well trailed. There's been quite a process. Darshini, can you just explain what the difference is between a spring statement and a classic budget is? Because this was not a budget.
Good grief. So much. And this is all live. But can I say, we've never done this live before on Budget Day or Spring Statement Day.
Some of us have. Some of us
have, but okay.
I think you can do it.
We can do this. We can so do this. This is not a major fiscal event, Adam, by which we mean that the Chancellor said there would be no tax rises, no tax changes. There was very little on the tax front in this announcement. There was, however, a forecast, which is meant to happen twice a year, and this was the Chancellor's response to that. And to keep to her own self-imposed fiscal rules, she had to make some tweaks. So those tweaks came in the form of spending. But once again, we knew about a lot of the stuff in advance.
And Faisal, you need to just bring your microphone in a little bit so we can hear you nice and clearly.
Yeah.
Faisal, help us understand this technical term that gets tossed around a lot on days like this. Headroom.
Yeah. Okay. So
Fiscal headroom.
So this is the interaction of the Chancellor's self-imposed rules on borrowing with the forecast. So you combine the two and you're given a room for manoeuvre. There's two different rules, actually, but we were kind of focused on one of them. And it gives some room for manoeuvre against things that go bump in the night in the economy that will, I'm mixing my metaphors here, that will kind of blow the ship off course. And that's exactly what happened. And at the budget, she left quite a small degree, a really quite small degree, more than Jeremy Hunt left her. And indeed, it was wiped out.
It was nearly about 10
just
billion,
under 10 billion. Yeah. And the story, the sort of broad story of today is essentially that gets wiped out by a rise in interest costs. And then she restores that headroom with the welfare cuts and then with some help from the Office of Budget Responsibility, assuming, lo and behold, that actually some of the policies they've already announced will help the economy grow. But actually, there weren't many moving parts here. That's essentially the subbed down tweetable story. A kind of 11 billion increase in the last year, 29-30, in interest, sort of 5 billion, and then you've got to make some adjustments on welfare, 2 or 3 billion extra on growth, and you sort of get back to where you were before. That's essentially what happened. Those are the choices, the big choices today.
And we'll dive into all the documents that we got today, because we got the spring statement from the Chancellor herself. We got the fiscal outlook from the Office of Budget Responsibility, the independent watchdog, which Faisal was hinting at there. And we also got this separate document, which is called an impact assessment from the Department for Work and Pensions, which actually sketched out kind of the real world consequences in pounds and pence for people of the changes to welfare that were announced last week. But Chris, before we dive into the economics, was there genuine politics at play here, and is there now politics evolving as a result?
Yeah, loads. So, I mean, in essence, there's been the argument, hasn't there, over the last few weeks about the significance otherwise of this day, exactly what it was going to be called. The Conservatives branding it an emergency budget. They were still doing that today. Mel Stride, the Shadow Chancellor, using that moniker. It shifted from a forecast to a statement, etc., etc. If we take a bit of a step back from that noise and we acknowledge that, yes, it wasn't a budget, so we're not talking about the additional pence on a pint of beer or what's happened to, fuel duty or income tax or whatever. In the end, it was one of those set-piece Westminster moments where for those who give events here a glance, however fleeting, it is an opportunity for them, for newscasters and the wider country, to take a judgment on the Chancellor in particular and the government more in general and their economic prospectus, a sense of, do we trust the government in its handling of the economy? And the core reason that today was a bigger deal than it was imagined to be a handful of months ago, whilst short of a budget, is that a sufficient amount had changed, as Faisal and Dharshini were reflecting there, that the government was, because of its own decisions and self-imposed rules, needed to rejig its spreadsheets, look again at where it was spending money in order to remain within those rules. So loads of politics and all of this, and then loads to come as Labour MPs digest, in particular, that impact assessment connected to the benefits changes, and then more widely the kind of consequences of this change in priorities, whether it be on defence or other things, as this government approaches its first anniversary in office.
Right, I think the main chart that tells the story about what this all means is from the Office for Budget Responsibility, and it is their projections for growth. Oh, I don't know what page it is, but we've got it on the screen in the studio here because we've upped our budget by 50 pence.
I didn't know you had.
Yeah,
you had that.
A man who's rarely flabbergasted has been flabbergasted. Anyway, but what this chart shows is that next year the projection for growth of the economy has been halved, and it's going to be 1%. But in all the years after that, the Office of Budget Responsibility bean counters have projected it's going to be a bit higher than they were expecting. So, Chris, first question to you, is that like a fatal blow for Rachel Reeves if actually in the first 2 full years of her being Chancellor, economic growth is going to be slashed as opposed to boosted, which is what she promised at the election?
I must admit, in order to see these new snazzy newscast graphics that I can't see in my little cupboard down here at Westminster, I was firing up the BBC News YouTube page in order to watch our very own podcast and be able to see the graph.
Which, of course, people listening on the podcast can't see.
No, and neither can I.
Which is why I use words to describe it for you.
Wonderful.
Which also
what a
them.
pro. Neither can I, dear audio listening newscaster, because I wasn't quick enough on YouTube.com. I can't remember what you asked me now.
He's broken the space-time equilibrium.
This is like a pantomime. It's behind you. The fact that, Chris, in 2025, rather than economic growth being 2%, is going to be 1%, according to the OBR. And that must be pretty awkward for a government that won an election on a promise of loads of economic growth.
Yeah, totally. I mean, completely that. There's a danger, isn't there, on a day like this? That rightly we start examining particular pages of particular documents and all of that. And, we do need to take those couple of steps back, particularly in terms of the political implications. The central mission, for that's the word that they use to describe it, of this government, when you look at its election manifesto from just under a year ago, was this idea of delivering economic growth. And there isn't. The story of it as it ebbs and flows is that there basically isn't very much. And then that projection of a lower growth forecast for this coming year from the watchdog, the Office for Budget Responsibility. Yes, there is, as the Chancellor points out, a projection from the forecaster of slightly more positive numbers in the years beyond this year. But that's difficult for the Chancellor, and hence you get the political pushback from the Conservatives and others, but particularly from the Conservatives today, who make the argument that so much of the, if you like, political and economic trouble into which she finds herself is self-inflicted. You can have an argument all day and for 24 hours non-stop and longer about the extent to which it's the international picture or the domestic picture that is a contributor towards her woes. But at least a central part of the charge coming from her political opponents is that this is something that she's contributed to. And whether she has or not, the bottom line is, at least for now, she isn't delivering on that promise of getting the economy growing again. And that kind of sluggishness of the economy is, I think, we have to come back to over and over again as a kind of controlling thought for so many people's outlooks on on life, on the economy, on politics, on government.
But Dharshini, the good news that Rachel Reeves would trumpet in this chart is that the reason growth has been revised upwards in future years comes down to actual Labour government policies, particularly around the planning system.
Now, this is interesting, this one, because this was an ongoing sort of tug of war between the OBR, who ultimately, of course, have sort of control over Rachel Reeves' options through these very forecasts. They're sending that framework there, that sort of backdrop. And they had accepted to put in various assumptions about these planning reforms and what they may mean for growth going forward, which is why you see, and I love the colours of these charts, by the way, the blue lines, the current forecasts for the latter years in this Parliament are higher than the yellow bars. We've got stronger growth. And that actually translates into my favourite chart in this book, one of them. I've got a couple, actually. If I'd known it was Bring Your Chart to Work Day, I would have brought it with me.
Sorry,
but,
send you the memo.
I think it's 2.14, the one that shows real household disposable income. And she was able to stand up and say, look, people are going to have more money in their pockets on average. Because what this translates into is that the average person after inflation will be, apparently, if this is right, over £700 better off in 2029 than they were in 2024. Previously, that was thought to be £500, which would have been the second worst Parliament on record for living standards. So that in itself has been a bit of a boost for her.
And Faisal, we got some numbers for the number of new houses that might be built as a result of the planning changes that the government have introduced. But it doesn't seem to be quite enough to hit their very ambitious target of 1.5 million new homes in England by the end of the...
You've conjured a new chart. This chart, they are incredibly excited about in Downing Street, because they've managed to get the OBR to score a policy that has cost them nothing. So in a way, it's for free in terms of the Treasury sort of OBR, as you call it, bean counting.
I mean that respectfully.
No, if anyone's counting beans out there, we've got nothing against you, right? And it's adding, they say, 170,000 new units over 5 years, which takes it up to 1.3 million. That's pretty. And I think the more important thing is it takes it up to 300,000 a year. You'd expect it to take a bit of time, getting houses through the planning system. And this is as a result of the National Planning Policy Framework changes that have been brought in. It doesn't take into account the changes in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill that's going through Parliament, which is going to restrict judicial reviews of infrastructure and all this sort of stuff. So
what, it could be even more next time?
I think it will be even more. They've set a precedent now. And if you take away the right to judicial review, that is a licence for planners. But this is a victory, and this is quite interesting. I mentioned the big moving parts because there really isn't much else in terms of policy. She talked a lot about this, including in her press conference in Downing Street. This is what I would call a win in the cells of a spreadsheet. It is not a brick being laid, or indeed an architect's
these are
plan
all imaginary
being approved.
houses.
They don't exist yet, and indeed, nor does the positive bit of the chart you showed on growth. That's all for the future. Now, I think the flip side is that the government will argue, well, that's what we can affect, and in fact, our policies are designed for medium-term wins, and that and they would blame the inheritance, although there is a reasonable argument to say that some of the pessimism contributed to the economy. But this is what this is about. It is significant that they got that victory, the biggest ever OBR scoring of a policy that is for free, and it will encourage them to do more of such things. So they say it's a big deal, but the fact that this is a big deal shows that in fact there's not a lot else going on today in terms of
interesting
policy.
Chris, what was the point you were going to make?
Was that to me?
Yeah. Or actually, or can I make a point to you, actually?
Yeah.
And it's about things that are not in the Office for Budget Responsibility projections. Things like they haven't scored, to use the parlance, for when they count up what the economic impact of a measure could be. They haven't scored the new employment rights that are going to be introduced by this government, which some employers are quite annoyed about.
And the Conservatives leapt on instantly.
Yeah. And also, they haven't accounted for what Donald Trump might do next week, which is to slap a whole load of tariffs or import taxes on imports from all around the world, including the UK. So all of this could be blown out of the water in a week.
Yeah, so firstly, just on the housing thing, I was struck, Faisal and I were sitting next to each other in the Politics Live studio as the Chancellor was on her feet, and it was the thing, because as you were saying, Adam, 10 minutes or so ago, that so much of this, was pretty widely trailed. We got to quite a lot of it in the last few days. That was the one bit where you think, whoa, that's quite something. The capacity of the government to have persuaded the OBR to score it, to use the vernacular, which from their perspective is very helpful. But then also the extent to which we're going to see, and we've been kind of aware of this for a while, but the government is now going to really, really lean in, I would expect, to build, as in fact Darren Jones, the Chancellor's deputy, said out loud on the telly when we were asking him just about this.
In a not at all cringe way.
Well, yes, it reminds me. I put that phrase to the Prime Minister a couple of months ago, and he used it back into the camera. Arguably it is a bit cringe, but I think they have looked across the Atlantic at some of the communication styles emanating out of the White House, and I think they are willing, where they can bring themselves to do it, to lean into it a bit, because it's pithy. But yeah, on that point about what's not in it, firstly, that element about the workers' rights stuff, point seized upon, as I say, by the Conservatives. Then, as you mentioned there, Adam, the whole business of Donald Trump and tariffs, etc., etc. And it is just worth making the point, isn't it, that in this argument about a changed world that Rachel Reeves has made, and you can pick away at that about the extent to which the world has changed and the extent to which she has responded to the world changing. But it's also probably worth emphasising that changed suggests past tense, doesn't it? Changing is perhaps more appropriate, and it could change massively in a way that would blow so many of these projections just clean out the water. But that is always the case, isn't it? With these things, that they are done and they offer various projections in various directions, but who on earth knows what's around the corner?
I was actually quite taken. I've just been speaking to Richard Hughes, the chair of the OBR, and he said that one of the
Did you tell him we now have a cardboard cutout of his head in the office?
I did not.
I
did.
Do,
I'm sure
Weekend
that will
Newscast.
Make his day. I know that he's an avid listener, but he said that a wider trade war, which we don't think that's a central scenario, but like in this commentary around the tariff war, everyone always says, it's never going to happen. Oh, this is never going to happen, and then it happens. That's what's happened over the past 3 months. But if you've got the sort of worst case scenario of 20% unilateral tariffs from the US on everything, then reciprocated, including on the UK, you would wipe out instantly. That would wipe out the headroom, recession territory for the UK this year. And then any sort of slightly lower version of it will take 0.2, 0.3, 0.4. So, and that's just one of the many uncertainties that he said. The risks to the outlook are very elevated, is how he put it to me. And actually, even as we speak, we await from the White House a confirmation now that Donald Trump is about to levy tariffs on all imports of cars of up to 25%.
Oh, so there was me thinking these economic projections might not survive a week. They might not survive a day.
Might survive this programme.
Yeah, exactly. Thank goodness we're live on YouTube, so we can then update it.
Now, so, and this is the interesting thing, will we have got an exemption? I'm not hearing that. No one's telling me that the UK's got an exemption. It's very relevant for some luxury car manufacturers that export to the US. But even if it didn't affect us directly, even if we were exempted, like a trade war between the US and the EU is going to affect us. So I was told yesterday that even the US and Canada going at it tit for tat on a trade war is a bigger shock to the world economy in trade terms than Brexit.
Right, which is why people should care about that spat between them. It's not a thing that's
and
happening
no one's backing
away.
Down there whilst there's an election on.
Yeah.
And so, this is not going to go away fully. I'd say the worst case scenario looks unlikely from where we are, but you can't rule anything out. Right?
Sorry, I interrupted Dharshini.
I was just going to say, President Trump, I don't think was mentioned by name during that speech, that statement by Rachel Reeves, but you could just feel his presence and influencing so many of the options, the decisions she had to take. So, we had that sort of increase, as we were talking about earlier, that increase in government borrowing costs, which has really sort of taken away the headroom as we think about it right now. We also, of course, have had that shift towards more defence spending, and the price we may be paying for that, therefore, is cutbacks in other areas. And then you look ahead and you think, well, there's all this. But what's really fascinating, when you look at the Office of Budget Responsibility actual book, they mention very early on, when they talk about growth, the drop in business and consumer confidence here in recent months, right? And we do know a lot of other economists who've made similar downgrades to their predictions have pointed the finger at the government's own policies for that rise in national insurance contributions, etc.
For employers,
Yeah. So whereas there is this whole world thing, I don't think we can forget domestically too, we have some issues going on.
And Faisal, just on that thing about the increase in government borrowing costs, so basically the interest rate the government has to pay to borrow money to fund spending from global investors. Why is the UK having to spend so much more? Oh, well, obviously we're spending more because the amount of debt that we've got is bigger. So of course the total interest is higher, but the actual rates yields, as it's known, are higher. Why is that?
So they started to go up in anticipation of the budget, but they were also starting to go up around the world. Then they sort of calmed down a bit. Then Trump's tariff agenda and the uncertainty around that led to the US yields going up. UK followed them. But then about a month ago, there was a change of view about the US, and the UK sort of detached from the US, and then in the markets was suddenly seen as European and not like the US at all. At the exact point that European yields went up. Why was that? Because of hundreds of billions of extra borrowing for rearmament. And so in essence, it was quite interesting to see, and this is a very real debate, and I just don't think it's going to go away as much as the Treasury and the Chancellor tries to shut it down. The fact that Germany has decided to park their, it's more than a rule, it's hardwired into their constitution. So this is a big deal for them. And it's a big deal even, as like...
Basically the rule that lets them borrow billions and billions more.
And so they were creating space to borrow over 10 years, €1 trillion. 500 billion for arms, 500 billion for infrastructure.
And that puts the cost of borrowing up for everyone.
It has put the cost of borrowing up in Germany by considerably, but they have low costs to begin with. But it's also brought up the costs here in the UK. And it's why, I don't know if you heard in the press conference, it was quite interesting. The Chancellor was asked about her self-imposed rules, which is, is how you describe her fiscal rules, and whether, what you're going to get as the political pain increases, whether it's on welfare, whether it's on departments, it's all going to happen as spending review happens. You're going to get people saying, well, why can't we just do what the Germans are doing? Literally, it happens now every day. And she will say, well, hang on, what's imposing discipline upon us? Yes, it's the rules, but it's actually the market. We could increase borrowing and we just end up increasing the amount of debt. That's their argument, but that argument is now live, real, being had. Now, if it continues with low growth and these yields being high, then we may face exactly the same sort of conversation. I'm not saying that's definitely going to happen. We shouldn't assume that there's definitely going to be a tax rise and a need to do the income tax threshold thing again. We shouldn't assume that because actually it could go in the other direction too. We can totally see actually growth could perk up, yields could come down, and then suddenly we'll be talking about windfalls, right? But it's very, very live. And then that other option that Germany is shining a light on, it's not going to go away. Okay. They'd love it to go away, but it's not going to go away.
Chris, let's make it very, very, very domestic now and kind of real as opposed to just spreadsheet chat, although the chat there was real, obviously. we now have numbers for the changes to disability benefits that last week were quite theoretical when Liz Kendall, the Work and Pension Secretary, announced them, but they seem much realer today as a result of this official government impact assessment.
Yeah, they do. And one of the curiosities here, and I'm just going to pull up the exact numbers so that we can make sure we reflect them accurately, is one of the curiosities is the sort of sequencing of what we've had here. So we had that big announcement around benefits a week or so ago with the Work and Pension Secretary, Liz Kendall, saying, "Oh, hang on a minute. Well, I can't actually tell you how many." And the actual all of the questions, to be honest, we couldn't get answers to that we really wanted to ask a week ago because she said, "Well, we're going to wait for the Office for Budget Responsibility." The argument was that there was market-sensitive information around all of that because there was projections around inflation into the future and blah, 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 and we would have to wait. Then we had the spectacle last night of the government acknowledging that the headline figure it had given us a week ago for how much money it thought it was going to save, about £5 billion, was out of step with what the Office for Budget Responsibility thought it would save. They were more cautious about how much money it would save. And so, as a result, the government was going to tweak what it was going to do. There were going to be some changes around the health element of universal credit in the years ahead for new claimants. So that was the first thing to play out. Then at lunchtime today, we get that impact assessment, and it estimates that by the financial year 29-30, so looking ahead 4 years from where we are now, there'll be 3.2 million families, some who are current recipients, some who are future projected recipients, who will financially lose out. On average, around £1,700 a year once you take inflation into account. And then 3.8 million families, again, some current recipients, some future recipients, set to be better off, albeit by a smaller margin on average, around £420 once you account for the impact of inflation. And I'm struck that today, a lot of the chat, inevitably, in a statement rather than a budget, is quite highfalutin. It's quite macroeconomic, necessarily, rather than pounds in pockets, extra penny on a pint, all that kind of stuff. Except, crucially, for those millions of recipients or potential recipients of benefits for whom, we're now getting the more granular detail of the impact of those changes, predominantly of a week or so ago, and then the tweak that we heard about today.
Although, Dharshini, the government say you can't just take these numbers in isolation because they haven't taken into account the £1 billion that the government wants to spend on helping those people get into work. They say it's not the full picture.
Well, there is that as well. So they do recognise you have to have some investment. But I think I said this last time I was on as well. This is coming against quite a fragile backdrop, right? We're saying there are people who want to work, let's help get them back into work and let's reduce the benefits bill. But when you look at the employment outlook at the moment, particularly in those kind of industries that employ those kind of people who are coming off benefits, they are the ones who are most vulnerable to the kind of tax rises we're going to be seeing, to the rise in the national living wage, to, as you mentioned there, that there's change in employee rights. So that big question mark over whether or not those jobs are going to be created in the way that the government hopes over the next few years.
So that's like an extra pressure. Also, Faisal, we got this measure for the number of people that might be pushed into relative poverty. I think we're going to hear a lot about this because it's 250,000 people, 50,000 of them are children. Obviously, the word poverty is a very evocative word. Can you just explain to us, like, when the government says relative poverty, what that actually means?
There's a line of income. And it essentially, in relation to that line, which is, I think, 2/3 of median income, if you're below that, if you're pushed below that in terms of your income, then you're below that line. It's a relative measure because the alternative measure is absolute, which is more about a certain sort of cash income. So, yeah, but it's the typical target measure that we have been used to is relative poverty. 250,000 is a lot. Some of the campaigning groups are saying actually you need to take into account the rowback on some of the Conservative policies, and actually the number is more like 400,000. That's their claim. I haven't fully checked that out yet, but certainly it is a tangible. I mean, clearly, you step back from this, hundreds of thousands of people are going to lose thousands of pounds.
No, millions of people, which I know is hundreds of thousands, but
hundreds of thousands of people are going to lose a few £1,000s, I think, is the point here. And what underlines what Chris was saying was the fact that the cliff edge here is so sharp for those people who can, and the technical thing is you can't claim 4 points anymore on the PIP form. That is so sharp that the incentive, again, as Richard Hughes pointed out, he feels that they will just claim that they do have those more severe incapacities or inabilities to do certain tasks.
Oh, so that's why the Office of Budget Responsibility didn't rate this as much of a saving as the government.
So, for example, it's the borderline between washing the top and bottom of your body or being able to deal with complicated budgeting versus simple budgeting. Some degree, and the fact that hasn't been looked at by doctors and analysed fully. So I just don't think we've seen the end of it. And when you boil it down to what I tried to do at the beginning, which is it's about the increase in interest cost, and the choice here is stick to the rules and cut the welfare bill. Now, and this is the other thing. They'd like to say, and their argument is this is part of a reform, a general reform where everybody wins. People get jobs, the benefit bill goes down, the tax take goes up because people are in jobs. It's all win-win. So what I question is whether this is exactly the reform you would choose to do if you were expecting the win to come in 3 or 4 years' time. Would you not have put a bit more money into the pushing people into work and reap the rewards of a lower benefit bill down the line rather than sort of cutting it up front. This is a classic argument about welfare reform.
And Chris, loads of Labour MPs, well, maybe not loads, that's probably exaggerating it, but certainly a few have said that they would vote against these changes to disability benefits. But the fact is, Labour's majority is so huge, you'd need masses of Labour MPs to vote against it for this to not go ahead.
Quite, yeah. It's the point I think we've made on Newscast before, but is worth mentioning kind of every time we're in one of these conversations. One is numbers and the other is sentiment. So firstly, Labour's majority is colossal. Secondly, it is a parliamentary party, broadly speaking, cast in Keir Starmer's image. The party gave a huge amount of thought prior to the election to candidate selection, and those who would be perhaps more likely than not most of the time to be loyal to the government's project. But that all said, there is no doubt there are some who are already vociferously uncomfortable. There are more who are not wildly comfortable. There are some who are irritated by the sequencing of events, which means that Rachel Reeves had to sort of come back for more today. So there's a with the massive caveats around the size of the majority and all the rest of it, the government has to be alive to an element of party management around all of this stuff, because this kind of conversation around benefits prompts for plenty of Labour MPs of whatever view a kind of first principles conversation in their own mind about what it means to be a Labour MP. And we saw the Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, sort of lean into this when she was on The World at One on Radio 4 yesterday, arguing that, you know, in her view, a core element of her Labour identity is, you know, the kind of clue in the title, that Labour is about work. You know, for others, they wouldn't dispute that, but they'd say, hang on a minute, what about the looking after the most vulnerable, to which the government counters that the most in need of support, those unable to work, will be supported more. But yeah, there's an argument that we'll keep an eye on amongst Labour MPs and all of this.
Right, one last thing to look at, one last set of numbers to unpick. Plans for public spending in the future, like the near future and the distant future. What is going on there? Well, we know there's a spending review, so literally every penny the government spends is being examined at the moment, and we'll get the results of that in June. What's happened today in terms of what they're planning? Silence. It's done.
No, I mean, there's a couple of things going on.
There is a couple of things going on. Indeed. You know, as you say, spending review happens then. What we do know is that to make the numbers add up, she's taken a little bit out of that total for public services in a few times.
Shaved it off.
Shaved it off. With
it was going to be an increase of 1.3% a year.
But don't let that fool you, Adam. You know
it's
better
now down
than
to 1.2% a year.
And if you take away those sort of priority areas, those protected areas, the OBR, you know, another one of my favourite charts, reckons that, you know, post 2026, you're looking at perhaps those budgets for unprotected areas falling by 0.8% per year in real terms, which sounds like a number on a spreadsheet again. And there's all sorts of course, as we've been hearing, moves to make services more efficient, do more with less. But ultimately, some of these services, and I'm talking about areas like justice, like transport, higher education, we already know that they are struggling. And so, but then, you know, this has happened before, right? We've seen Chancellor after Chancellor come up with these numbers to square the fiscal rules. And when it comes up to that point, they actually find a bit more money.
It should be said that is in the last 3 years of the Parliament. In the first couple of years, there's been a significant injection. So over the 5 years, it's very difficult to say this is austerity. And you can't really say it's austerity. There was actually real-term cuts overall in spending. And the other thing here that's really interesting and may be a feature of this now going forward is there's been significant increases in capital spending. And capital spending. And so you saw this, there was a little peroration from Rachel Reeves talking about spending this much in Plymouth and this much in Aldershot and this much in Barrow-in-Furness. And it was all physical capital spending from that budget.
In other words, refurbishing the naval base in Plymouth.
And I think there was something on military housing. And that's interesting because what's happened is by shifting money from the aid budget, which is day to day, into defence spending and counting it as capital, that doesn't count against her constraints. So it's an accounting rule. And so you're going to get that. Now, you might say, well, this is weird accounting, tail wagging the dog. Or maybe it's actually the incentives you want asserting themselves. So we're going to spend money. We're going to squeeze money day to day, and we're going to spend money on capital that at least gives you an asset that may help with growth in the future. And the big question for me now is we have an infrastructure a strategy, a trade strategy, an industrial strategy, potential deals with the US and Europe. This is a big move. The government kind of actually, in order to make those charts that you show come to life, they need to grip this now and make, the UK growth story very, very real. And there's an opportunity over the next 2 or 3 months.
Chris, final thing to you. I was quite struck by Paul Johnson, who's the outgoing head of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the think tank, who was on TV with you and Faisal at lunchtime. And he said all of this, both the decisions that have been made today, the projections that have been provided today by the OBR, just what's happening in the world at the moment. This is a recipe for basically 6 or 8 months of speculation about how huge the next budget's going to be and the difficult choices the Chancellor might have to make at the end of the year, or what the headroom might. And we're basically going to be sort of monitoring all of this stuff every day because everything's just so fluid right now. And it comes back to that point we started with about headroom, that if you don't have a lot of cash in the bank for a rainy day, you're going to be looking out the window at the weather every day.
Yeah, I think that's basically. Sorry, more and more slick the longer this goes on. I think there's a sort of fundamental truth in there, and I think for 2 reasons. One is because of this complex, and some see it as sort of absurd system where you have this sort of delicate dance between the government and the Office for Budget Responsibility, and what the forecaster decides to score, to use the Whitehall vernacular. And we've talked about that in the context of benefits, and indeed in the context of house building. But then the OBR is a fundamental kind of crutch of economic credibility for the government. They lean into that. They think that is really important. Then, of course, as you say, you've got the stuff that is projected into the future, but then the acknowledged imponderables, whether that be tariffs or plenty of other things. And then on top of that, you had in the autumn the Chancellor choosing within her self-imposed rules to then park herself very close to them, in other words, give herself very little room for manoeuvre, then making a virtue today of re-establishing a similar amount of headroom, i.e. not a lot, and making the various twists and turns in order to get to that, but therefore ensuring that, there's not much room for manoeuvre now either. Now, depending on how things go, but that may or may not be an issue for her, but it is entirely possible that the question is at least asked. Yeah, absolutely. What happens come the autumn, given that right now, given the speed of change in the last couple of months since the re-arrival of Donald Trump in the White House, the inauguration seemed quite a long time ago. So October seems a million miles away.
Yeah. And Faisal, last question to you. You were at the press conference the Chancellor did in Downing Street, in the press conference room there, and we learned a very, very important fact about her. She's not a Sabrina Carpenter fan. And she linked that to her age. She said, as a 46-year-old woman, you'd be surprised if I liked Sabrina Carpenter. Yeah. What was the mood in the room when that revelation came forth?
I think, probably
a lot of 40-somethings.
Well, there probably wasn't. It was a little bit late for that press conference. There was a lot of people probably not quite listening to their Sabrina Carpenter songs on their AirPods when she walked in. We talked about Donald Trump running the world. I think the question is, does Richard Hughes of the OBR, in fact, secretly run the world?
No, Sabrina Carpenter does.
I actually put it to him, and he said, no, basically I've got no power. The Chancellor controls 1.5 trillion of spending and of taxes. I just do the spreadsheets. I think there'll be a debate about the role of the OBR.
This is the OBR, amazing innovation, really helpful for us as journalists because they print off lovely books for us and keeps the government honest. But there is an alternative world where a strong politician says, I respect the OBR, but I think they've got it wrong. There's an alternative. But you can't do that, as Chris said, if you've built your entire reputation as Chancellor on sticking to what the OBR says. Yeah. It's another thing Rachel Reeves has done to constrain herself, and she might, in the history books, might judge that quite harshly.
Right, because they've let her have that bit about planning reform to boost growth. Mm-hmm. So in this, a bit of a lifeline thrown there, but who knows? It was quite a stark warning from Richard Hughes, I thought. Quite unusually stark to come out and say that. I think you're going to be getting that sort of cardboard cutout of him quite a lot.
And as we know from previous episodes of Newscast, half the people on this episode are actually Shabuzi fans.
Absolutely right.
Because we'd made a Newscast playlist.
I was delighted, Dharshini, to hear that you're a fellow Shabuzi.
Well, I made his gig last week, in fact. I did.
Did you?
Oh, my God. So 3/4. the chart of fans is now going up very, very fast.
Great.
I'd say we'll be at Sabrina Carpenter, but we definitely should.
I don't.
I mean, the big news.
I don't know who these people are.
Well, the big news for me is Lady Gaga's tour. So that's joint top story today.
That might boost the economy.
It might, yeah.
Yeah, but to Taylor Swift levels.
We could do a
do.
group outing, I'm sure.
Exactly. I'm not sure we'll be
How
able
many
to
gigs
afford
in
it.
the UK?
I think she's going to do 2 or 3.
Wow, well, blimey. I mean,
I'm just. You talk
is
about
that scored in the book? I'm going to have to have a look.
No, but you talk about imaginary numbers on a spreadsheet. I'm thinking about an imaginary Lady Gaga concert because the idea of me actually getting any tickets, like it's going to be a stampede. So anyway, right, let's stampede out of the Newscast studio. Thanks everyone for being with us.
Thank you.
No worries.
And thanks to you for watching us do this live episode of Newscast. Hope you enjoyed it. You can listen to our podcast, which is beautifully edited. After we've talked
Get the edit. Get the
every
shears out.
day
Get the axe. Get the
on
chainsaw.
BBC Sounds.